What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Dynasty Underdog. Billy Beeman here, Uriah with me as always. And this week we have another special guest with us, the Wiz, Dan Whisner of the Undroppables at Dan J. Whisner on Twitter. How you doing, bud?
What's up, man? I'm glad we finally got to do this. You know, you and I kind of go back a little bit ways back to our days at DFF. And, I love the stuff that you guys have been doing over at Dynasty Underdog recently. It's been really cool to see you guys grow. And, I'm super happy to join you guys tonight.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Love that, dude. Love that. Yeah, we did connect a little bit when you had a cup of coffee with DFF. You quickly shifted over to the Undroppables where you've seen great growth, man, and you've been able to create some really unique tools, which we'll get into today. But I really wanted to get to know you a little bit better because, like, you and I, we go back and forth on Twitter a bunch. But again, This is our first time really connecting outside of the Twitterverse. So I wanted to get to know a little bit about your Dynasty history, right? We generally do that when we have a new guest on the show. And so I'm always interested to know, like, how long have you been playing Dynasty? When did you get into this?
Yeah, so really, first startup was 2020, but it does kind of go back longer than that. So if you think about it, I was on a keeper league on ESPN starting in 2011 with me and 12 of my buddies from home, right? So like we've been doing fantasy for like quite a while. Next year's big year for us. We got year 15. But ironically, like that whole time that we were on ESPN, man, we were doing 2 quarterbacks. And so this was like before Superflex was like a thing. And so after moving away from ESPN, because like I had kind of seen Sleeper around a little bit, back in 2020 and was like, platform just like looks so much better than ESPN. Like, let's give it a shot. And since we were moving over platforms, that's when we were like, you know what, let's go to a true dynasty as opposed to keeper. And so that's when we kind of started that first startup. It's a home league though. So, right. So that was the opportunity for the rest of the guys to vote and say, look, I'm sick of 2 quarterbacks. And it was basically like right as the Superflex revolution kind of started, right? Like 4 or 5 years ago, we decided to kind of move away from it, which is just super ironic. But standard home league. So yeah, that's when I first got into it. And then, these past couple of years, taking on some orphans, joined a couple startups, and, now it's just kind of part of the daily rhythm.
Excellent. Yeah. I love that, dude. I just want to ask, like, what kind of turned your attention to creating content? Like, what gave you the idea, like, hey, I've been playing fantasy for 10 plus years, but now I'm in Dynasty and now I want to start talking a little bit more about this stuff and giving advice. Like, what kind of made you take that turn?
Yeah, man. So I thought about it for a while, right? Like, me and my buddies from home, like we talk sports all the time. I'm a Boston guy, so like I'm pretty, deeply rooted in anything sports, right? So
another Patriots fan on the pod. Oh boy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And yeah, man, like we kind of talked about it, like, just talk sports amongst ourselves, like for years now. And I had always kind of thought about doing it. And then actually it was just over a year ago. I was like, you know what, I'll just make a Twitter and see what happens. And, cause I was like seeking like some dynasty, like content on Twitter. And I started just kind of following more people and really get more involved in the space. And I was like, you know what, let's give it a shot. And like, obviously super slow at first, like anything else, but there were some really great people that kind of helped me start, at least, just like interact with me and, give me advice and whatever. And, one thing kind of led to another. And, I put out a couple things, people liked what I had to say. And then, just obviously, like you mentioned, the cup of coffee with DFF, and then, getting hooked up with the guys over at Undroppables has just been kind of great for what I was able to do, right? Like certain commitments I can make, certain commitments I cannot, and they were just really flexible about it. And yeah, man, it's been a lot of fun. I think one of the coolest things is I've met some really cool people in the space, like yourself included. Uriah, I don't think we know each other too well, but I've seen some of your stuff on Twitter, and again, I love what you guys are doing. But yeah, man, I gotta say I've had more fun than I thought I would, because I know a lot of people have said like it can be super toxic and everything like that, but I think you kind of get out what you put in.
Oh, absolutely.
I love that little nugget from you, man. It's absolutely true.
So when you're doing a startup or taking over Orphan, is there any certain strategy that you stand by, positions you target or positions you don't? Is there a way you like to go about starting your teams?
Yeah, so I would say up until this year, for me, it's been, build my team around the young wide receivers, right? Like I'm a wide receiver guy at heart. That's like what I'm always going to be. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but like a lot of my data dumps on Twitter, like they're wide receiver related. Just you can go deeper on them from an analytical perspective, which is why I just kind of gravitate towards that a little bit. So that was my strategy for, the past few years, right? And I butchered that 2020 startup like all hell. Um, I took Joe Mixon I took Joe Mixon and Miles Sanders at the 1-2 turn, and realized basically like learned how to play Dynasty like 3 months later, and
yeah,
like
trial by fire.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically what I did was I was like, all right, I'm just going to blow it up. And I started thinking about like, if I'm going to blow it up and try and think of a plan forward, like what's the best way to do that? And just kind of looking at the way values were going and this was kind of towards the start of the zero RB, right? Like back in 2020, like it was talked about a little bit. But just thought that was a great way to keep value, or like a store of value as far as young wide receivers. So that's what I gravitated towards and largely still do, right? But I think one of the things that I have thought about this offseason for the first time was investing in like one of the 3 elite RBs, right? Like in certain spots, like that's where I do kind of think about that, because, you've seen what McCaffrey's been able to provide, when he's healthy, right? And then, obviously that's not what we wanted from Bijan his rookie year, but it feels like after these first few elite RBs that it's a large kind of flat tier for me. And we've seen what happens to their value like extremely quickly. So I'm trying to look for those guys that are super insulated. And one of the things is like, I do think that whether it's this year or next year, like if you're able to have like a Bijan or a Brees or a Gibbs, or even, you get lucky enough to have one or like 2 of them, I think you're going to end up having a positional advantage that's like similar to what we saw. I'm not saying Travis Kelce positional advantage, but I do think with like the lack of like elite running back options, right? Like you look at the wide receivers and there's just so many good guys, like the difference between like wide receiver 12 in Dynasty in points per game and like wide receiver 24 is like a couple points. Right. And then you look at the RBs and it's like there's a massive difference if you have those elite ones. So again, to answer your question, it's still wide receivers, but like I've toyed with the idea of like starting to, and I did it once last year. I took Gibbs in a startup in the 3rd round, right? And just kind of thinking about that.
I love that answer, because it's kind of in line with, I think, how I'll speak for myself though, how I definitely approach things. I talk a lot about transition periods, trying to identify those. And when I say transition period, I'm looking at like the running back position right now, where you have a few top guys and we are just so hungry and thirsty for the next group of good players to kind of take over and at least push them, right? Some competition there, like you're saying, for the wide receivers where we've gotten. But I do think that it's such a viable strategy still to take one running back. Like that hero running back strategy is so real still. And I hear a lot of people talk about being thin at wide receiver. And I don't think that's a, impossible way to work. Like you can definitely be thin at wide receiver and be strong at tight end and quarterback and kind of work from there and make up your points. But I do think that with the depth of wide receiver position, what you're talking about is a really, really good strategy to roll with right now. You get like, I won a league last year with one running back, Jahmyr Gibbs, and I think that that's really possible because you can backfill with a lot of good wide receiver production and good tight end production. That's kind of how I've built my team. So I like that answer. I think that that's kind of what the market is telling us to do right now. Right. So it makes sense. Okay, cool. I'm just always interested to kind of pick apart like what you do when you get into startups, like what your strategy is, because some people, have totally different strategies. They go hard at the quarterbacks, like the QBX strategy when we talk to like Tommy B and the Super Flex Super Show boys, right? Like there's all different stuff. So I was interested in that. But what I do want to get into is some of the nerdy stuff. We do love that around here, right? And you've done some really, really cool work for the Undroppables, having your hand in the Unscore. So we're going to get in that in a second. But you were talking a little bit about, your data dumps. I see you on Twitter all the time. So are you just a sicko? Like, are you just in your sheets all day long? Like, hey, like I'm just digging for whatever I can find and put out there. Or do you have like a specific idea in your head, like each morning and like, you're going to go look for X?
So it's funny you say that. So when you sent the show sheet over, Trav and I were actually preparing for our pod, and I read that note that you had on there. And Trav just goes, dude, you're just a sicko. Like, that's just what it is. And I was like, you know what? I like, honestly, like I am. But to your point, you know, I think one of the things that there are some ideas that I have, right? Like where, you know, specifically the other day, I wanted to look at, you know, some of the elite wide receivers. What did they do in their third year? Right. And then what does that look like for some of the third year guys that we have? Because we've got some really interesting guys coming into their third year with, you know, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Jameson Williams. Like it was a really interesting class in 2022. So there are some ideas where, you know, that pop into my head, but honestly, man, like there's some times where, you know, I've built just kind of not built, but like just acquired a lot of data like over the past year. And sometimes I'm just like kind of in there and I'm like, all right, like, you know, this kind of looks cool. Let me just go down this rabbit hole. And if I find something interesting, then, you know, I just try and end up sharing it. But I think a lot of what I'm looking for now is like, it's definitely kind of for like a pod or something like that. You know, just to provide nuggets here and there. Now that we're through like the draft and like the release of the, you know, Unscore and stuff like that, I do want to get back to, you know, trying to get back into articles because like that was one of my goals in 24, but like it's just been so hard with everything that's going on. So yeah, I guess, you know, I'm a sicko, man.
The articles, man. The podcasts are so much easier these days, aren't they? It's
I know.
And what's funny is you still got to do a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of prep for the pods, but something about it, it's like when you put it down on wax on paper, you're like, this has to be perfect. So you look at it like a billion times. So I can understand the struggle of kind of getting back into the article game for sure. Did you, I guess, in terms of like the data you use, this is kind of a question from one sicko to another. Like, where are you getting your data? Excuse me. Where are you getting your data? Is it from like PFF? Are you combining different sources, or do you guys at the Undroppables have like your own suite?
No, so it's definitely like a combination of certain things, man. I think, you know, like StatHead's great for going back like super far, right? Like I do think there's some value there because like, you know, something like PFF, like you can't go back to like 2000 or 2009 and stuff like that, right? Which is like super frustrating in itself. But like PFF from like, you know, pretty much like 2014, 2015 on, like it's got like most things in there. Really from like 2018 on, it's got a ton of stuff. And I really use PFF a lot for college guys, right? Because like, I think that's just like where I found like the most success as far as like looking for some of that stuff. When it comes to the NFL stuff there, I do use PFF a little bit, but I love what the guys over at Fantasy Points have done.
It's incredibly good.
Dude,
it's
that
ridiculous.
data suite, man, I use it for everything. You know, and the only bummer is I only go to PFF when I have to go back older than 2021, right? Because they've only got 21 through 23 in there right now. So like as that gets built out, like that'll be awesome. But like that interface, just being able to export straight out of it, like the amount of like customization and filters you can do, like that right there, like honestly poking around and stuff like that data suite has given me ideas for data dumps, you know, like.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I just got access to that like a month or two ago. And yeah, I'm just like, now that we're kind of past the rookie eval season, I have a little more time. I'm gonna dive in there and try to create my own source of truth per se. You know,
it's like drinking from a fire hose at first, man. Like you don't even know what to do because like anything that like you can almost think of is like, oh, like there's a filter for that. So
yeah, no, it's exciting, man. Okay, cool. That's interesting. All right, so let's get into the meat and potatoes here. I really want to know about this Unscore, right? So you guys created, I mean, you can definitely get more into it, but from outside looking in, you guys created what looks like a receiving metric, right? A metric
it's
for
essentially
receivers.
like it's a prospect model, pretty much.
So you guys created a prospect model. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to know, and you don't need to give us the secret sauce, right? Like I know how these things work, but I am really interested in kind of what the inputs are for the Unscore, how it's kind of calculated, just kind of like some background on like what this thing is and what it's doing.
Yeah, so it was actually kind of discussed when, you know, Jax reached out to me. I want to say Jax reached out to me in like mid-December, something like that. And was like, hey man, like, you know, I've seen some of the data stuff that you're doing on Twitter. Like if you ever want to do anything or put anything out there, you know, feel free, like you're welcome to join the Undroppables. Like it was super casual. Like that was how it happened. And I was like, all right, man, that's cool. And I kind of thought about it for a little bit. And, you know, I hit him up a few weeks later and this was like the beginning of January. And I was like, yep, let's do it. And one of the things that we talked about was like, what do we want to like accomplish? And I think one of the things that we were thinking about was, like he knew that I was a data guy from some of the Twitter stuff. And, he's done some really cool things over there. Like the anatomy series that he does is really awesome. Just kind of looking at some stuff, like there's metrics involved or analytics involved, but like a lot of the times it's like, it's height, it's weight, it's like, prospect grade, like 3, 4, 5 stars, like stuff like that. But what we really wanted to do was get more calculated. And so we started thinking about like, what are some of the things that you think are valuable with wide receivers? And me, him and Chalk, like that's how it started. We started bouncing ideas off each other. And then we said, you know what, like, let's try and give this a go. So I just started compiling like so much college data going back to like 2015, just kind of getting ready for it. And, as we kind of went through it, we made the list of like what we deemed important. And it's actually kind of ironic because, that first article that I wrote for DFF, one of the things that I mentioned in there and just kind of touched on for like why Chris Olave is somebody that I really like was it wasn't necessarily first downs per out run, but it was like first downs per snap. Right. And so like I had this idea in mind of like first downs like being kind of a thing. So like that was one thing that we wanted to include in there. Right. And I told Jax, I was like, dude, there's something here. Like I don't know exactly what it is, but like there's something here. And then obviously like there's some other stuff in there. Like, you've got your zone yards per out run. There's man in there a little bit, but like there's not a ton of correlation or predictive success in there. You've got like adjusted yards per team play in there, EPA per team pass attempt, reception yards per game, reception TDs per game, which was actually kind of interesting. And then, there's some additional factors in the model as well. Like, Power 5. There are early declare adjustments in there. We have some conference adjustments in there. And then obviously there's a draft capital element as well. I'm probably going to go ahead and go out on a limb and say ours does not weight draft capital as much as some other models, which is why we've gotten some of the results that we have. And so the big kind of step for this, man, right, is if we kind of go back to the beginning, is like Chalk ended up bringing in FF Coder. I'm not sure if you guys know him.
Yeah. I've talked to him on the side myself, actually.
Yeah.
Before I knew that he was doing this stuff for you guys. It's funny.
Yeah. He's fantastic, man. I got kind of hooked up with him when Chalk brought him on in February, and we just kind of clicked right away. And so like, I was compiling stuff, but we needed somebody to kind of help build whatever we were going to do. And, he had some experience as far as, building out, like a quarterback model that he built for, one of his apps that he did. But he had never kind of done anything like this either. So we just kind of went through it. And basically what we did was, we wanted to look at it from a more recent perspective, right? Because the NFL has changed from where it was, in 2010 to now, right? And plus two, some of the PFF data only goes back so far. So you can't make it go back like with what we wanted to include. And so, we looked at it from like 2018 to 2023 class, and, we got 180 players in those classes. Basically, we took to every wide receiver that was drafted and ran them through that first time. And, after we ran them through that first time, there really wasn't a whole lot that we did to adjust after that. And that's where we were kind of surprised at some of the results, like guys like last year, like, having like Tank, Rasheed, and Puka land in the top 5 last year. Like that was just something that like we didn't try to do, but it just kind of happened. Right. And obviously it's not perfect, right? Like it didn't like DK, it didn't like Terry McLaurin, like it has misses, right? Like every model should. But one of the things that we kind of not adjusted, but factored in after the fact that was not originally in there was like contested target percentage. And that just helped identify some guys like, Quentin Johnston, Jalen Reagor. So as far as process goes, man, like it was a lot of like late night discussions, bouncing ideas off each other and just like, getting people's dynasty kind of view and like, what do you deem important as far as like, when you look at a wide receiver that you want to invest in, like, what are you valuing for them? And then we tried to just compile these things together and see what came out.
That's awesome. It's kind of taking that anatomy of a wide receiver and breaking it down and really honing it in on like what is the most important factors here. Big shout out, by the way, to FF Coder. Dude is like super nice, generous, helpful, everything. Dude, so just wanted to put that out there. Anything I've reached out to him about, he's like, yeah, I could help you with that. I'm like, really? Like, you're just incredibly nice and generous. So
I mean, the whole team, man, like, I can't thank, Jackson Chalk enough for kind of, bringing me on and kind of pulling me in early into their process. And then, having Coder come on, guys like Fantasy Dukes do all the artwork for us. And then,
Yep.
Trav really helping with like the social side and everything like that. It was a really fantastic team effort that like couldn't have been done without everybody. So.
No, that's really cool, man.
All right. Well, we did reach out to the folks on our Discord saying, hey, we're going to have the Wiz on. Is there any questions you want to ask? So one of our guys asked, and you kind of touched on this. Like if this was the first iteration of trying to have a model, you could kind of skip over it. But was there a particular change in the model that all of a sudden things shifted and just locked in compared to previous iterations of the model? Or was this just brand new? Sounds like it's just brand new. But
yeah, I mean, it really was kind of just brand new, right? I think, the one iteration or one change that was like a big factor in after kind of that initial run through was looking at some of that contested target stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Because that just kind of smoothed out some of the, let's just call them frauds, right? Like, Big 12 receiving production specifically, like there's a lot of guys that came out of there that, had great production, but when you look at some of the contested target stuff, like that kind of helped smooth it out a little bit. But yeah, like this is our first time going through this, right? So like, we know this thing's not perfect. We're really proud of what we built, but like at the same time, we know that, this is like a living, breathing thing, right? Like we're going to constantly, look at making tweaks. Like, how do we make it better? Like as new information comes in, or as we keep learning in the space and talking to other people that, have models as well, like how can we make ours better? Like that's one thing that, we came into this saying was that we want to be, extremely open, but also extremely fluid with the model, right? Like we don't want to just be like, you know what, that's it. We made it. And it's going to stick like that forever. Right. Because with the league changing as much as it is, we want to make sure that we're kind of reacting to that in the appropriate way.
Okay. I'm going to change this next question here really quick a little bit because this is the model. Do you guys have any plans to develop this out for other positions? Right. Because I know it's really wide receiver, but I'm sure you could kind of tailor it to tight end fairly easily from here, but like running back, quarterback, is that a plan for the future?
So quarterback, probably not. Because honestly, man, it's like nobody can figure out quarterback. So like, we're not going to be like those guys that are like, oh yeah, we're definitely going to be able to figure it out. Like
we're the ones to do it.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of smarter people than me that have tried. So I'll let that one kind of fall by the wayside. But now that we wanted to focus on one and get something out for kind of draft season. And given the fact that, we kind of felt most comfortable with some of the data and like, some of our experiences with wide receivers, we focused on that one. But we just started kind of the first steps is on the running back one, as well as the tight end one. To your point, man, there are some tweaks from the wide receiver one that you can make to the tight end one, but there are going to be some definitely different metrics that are in there because just kind of looking at some certain things, the way guys pop from a tight end perspective, like it's much different. And then just kind of weighing, like in the wide receiver model, there's like nothing for athleticism, right? Like there's nothing in there for RAS. There's nothing in there for combine or anything like that. But like we have talked about potentially something like that with tight end, because like it really does mean a heck of a lot with tight end. So in the very early stages, but yeah, we're looking to do it for next draft season. We'll have one for running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers.
That's exciting. Something to look forward to for sure. All right. Do you mind walking us through the 10 rookie pass catchers per the Unscore for the 2024 class? I'm kind of interested to see if there are any surprises in there.
Yeah. So there's probably a couple. So here's one of the most ironic things, and we couldn't believe it when it first happened. We ran the 24 class through, and Neighbors and Harrison scored the exact same score down to the decimal point. And like they win in different ways, man. Like they're like Neighbors is better at certain things than that the model values than MHJ. So seeing that was just kind of like, wow, man, like that was fun. So those guys come in tied for first. Then this is where it gets interesting. So remember, this is like a raw score perspective, right? Like this is, and a lot of what the UN score is, it's like, it's analytics, man. Like, so if somebody has a great profile, then it is what it is. Troy Franklin still comes in at 3, even with the 4th round draft capital, right? So like, that's where like, and I know we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. So like, I'll save that conversation for then, but he comes in at 3, Odunze comes in at 4, McConkey comes in at 5, Worthy at 6, Jermaine Burton at 7. Wow. And Jalen McMillan at 8. And it's really funny because your last bullet point is who we're going to talk about, but Luke McCaffrey is 9 and Ryan Thomas Jr. is 10. So those are the top 10.
Wow. Okay. So Burton, McMillan, and McCaffrey probably the most.
McMillan one, I think, is probably the most shocking.
Jalen McMillan up in the top 10. That is really surprising. What do you think? What do you think it was by the numbers that really pushed him up into the middle of the top 10 there?
Yeah, so he had a low contested catch rate in college. And one of the things that he also does well is like, first downs per route run was pretty solid for him. The thing is, like, there's context needed here, right? Because like while these guys are in the top 10, this is something that I've kind of been stewing on for like a little bit. And you've probably seen from other people on Twitter as well, but like, there is like a good part of me that like thinks this class is like quite a bit overrated. And obviously like I come from an analytics perspective, right? Like I look at film, I watch film and everything like that. But like at the end of the day, like I'm going to lean towards the analytics to like break a tie for me or anything like that. Or from like kind of unsure on a guy, like I'm probably going to lean towards the numbers in that side. I just think the class is super top heavy. And then I think there's some guys that are like extremely interesting, like a Brian Thomas Jr., Javon Baker, like, and then you have guys like Keon Coleman, Xavier Legette, like Ricky Pearsall, like all these guys people love. Like these are guys that typically, if you just like look at historically, these guys just like don't hit.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where, I think this class is like a fascinating case study for like film versus analytics, right? Because you look at Twitter and a lot of people I respect and value their work and everything like that, will tell me that Ricky Pearsall is like absolutely legit. Right. And, and that's why I think it's really important that, if you're using the Unscore or, you incorporate it into your process, like you don't just follow it. Right. Like, it's not just like hey, this spit it out. So that's like how you have to draft these guys. The way that we've kind of phrased this up is like, it's just another tool in your toolbox, right? Like make it part of your process. If you're evaluating film and looking at some analytics, maybe just like use this as another like box to check as far as going through everything. And maybe it unearths somebody that you weren't looking at, or maybe it makes you go back and take a second look at somebody that like you're kind of on the fence about. Right. So it's by no means like hey, this is what the score spit out, let's go and do it. But yeah, just it kind of opened our eyes at some guys like, hey, let's go back and take a look at some of these guys and why.
Have you, it's not a sheet, but have you run regression on your model over, fantasy points years 1 through 3 based on that? Okay.
Yeah. So, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Yeah. So basically what we did was, and this is like in the introduction for the Unscore, right? So if you haven't got a chance to check it out, feel free to head over to the undroppables.com. We've got it over there right now. It's $20 and it's got draft classes from 2018 to 2024. So there's 215 players in there, and there's full college profile stats on every single one. And I mean, it's a 54-page document, right? So like, there's a lot to go through as far as like, data that you can reference and everything like that. But from like, if you look at some of the score ranges, right? So any guys that scored over 90 plus, which is only like 4 guys in the model, basically what we did was we looked at fantasy points per game in the NFL years 1 through 3, right? Like we just wanted to see like how it kind of translated. And so those guys, those 90 plus guys are, averaging 15.4 fantasy points per game, those first years 1 to 3. Anybody that scores in the 80 to 90 range, those guys are averaging 13 points per game, years 1 to 3. 70 to 80, it's just about 11.5. And then this is where, right after 70, this is where it starts to drop off. So you've got 44 players. So just to kind of give you an idea, 4 players over 90, 9 players between 80 and 90, 15 players between 70 and 80, 44 players between 60 and 70. And the average score, the average fantasy points per game for those guys is 6.2. right? So you see a significant drop off there. You know, from a percentage perspective, only 20% of that 44 has gone over 12 fantasy points per game in years 1 to 3, right? So like the hit rate, you're seeing it significantly drop. Whereas you look at the 70 to 80 range, those 15 guys in there, 53% of those guys are still hitting 12 points a game, right? So like it's much like the hit rate is much higher there. It truly becomes, you know, kind of dart throws to a certain degree once you get into the 60s. And then anything below 60, man, it's like it's almost like dead space, but it's 3.7 fantasy points per game those first few years. So
excellent.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Definitely telling based on, you know, the ranges that these guys are scoring in. I think you can do a quick like visual eye test and be like, all right, I know who I'm going to avoid here and who I can at least kind of put into the pot of like players who may matter, right? I think I'm always interested in these things, whether it's like straight metrics, like what it would look like if we could weight, you know, add in weighting like a film score of sorts, like marrying those two together and seeing how it looks. Obviously, that's probably the process, is like you taking this and then you're going to go either do your own film analysis or use somebody else's and kind of marry those two things. But I always think about like, what if we actually just create the formula and look at it like that and see what it looks like. Just throwing that out into the ether.
No, so I brought it up like 3 weeks ago, and obviously like we're down the road at this point, right? Like we're committed to what we've got for this year and everything like that. But like, that was one of my kind of things where it was like, you know, this is something that we need to look at in the off season. And I think, you know, the guys, everybody's like super open to it, but I do think, you know, we want this to be agnostic as possible, right? Like that's why like we didn't incorporate it, but you know, I do think there's value in not having something that's just like strictly numbers to tell a better story, right? Because like what you're trying to do for these guys by giving them this score or placing this value on them that comes out of this model, you're trying to tell a story of like what their career or value could look like, right? And like the only way to really tell that full story is to take all the information into account. And so that's why we're just like, we want to play around with it and see like, you know, how much of that goes into it without kind of taking away what we originally try to build. But I'm with you, man. I think there's value in trying to build some of that in. It's just, what does that process look like? And that's just going to be something that's, you know, we test throughout kind of the off season, but you know, for next year.
There's no off season, brother.
There's no off
season. It's point scoring season and non-point scoring season. Okay.
Exactly.
That's it.
We get no breaks.
we get no breaks. No, I think like you want to stay true to the UN score, and I don't think you want to kind of break that trust with like the base of it being data, right? Like that, I kind of like that, and you like having those different sources. But I mean, you guys could always have a new tool, whatever that kind of implements film. I don't know what it is, but I do think that there's definitely something there that you guys can build out. Before we move on to like the next point here, I do want to just touch on Brian Thomas, because he was at the bottom of the list at 10, which I thought was a little interesting. Obviously still in the top 10, still good, but it made me think of, do you guys account at all for like teammate, like a teammate score type thing? Cause like, obviously he played with Malik Neighbors. Like I'm wondering if his analytics are impacted by playing next to such a great talent, if that's accounted for, or if you guys decided amongst yourselves, like, yeah, that's just not going to matter for us.
So it's not in there as of now, but it's been discussed, because I do think you're right. Like it, again, when you're trying to tell the full story of a prospect, you know, Brian Thomas doing some of the things that he did with Malik Neighbors, you know, it's impressive, right? But then like the flip side of that is, was he doing impressive things because of Malik Neighbors, right? Because Malik was garnering so much attention from opposing defenses. Did that allow him to just like run those go routes and basically just kind of have free reign, just jumping over dudes because he's a freak in nature, right? Like, so it kind of it goes both ways, man. But it's definitely something that we've discussed, because like, you know, when I think about trying to tell that story, these are things that I'm thinking about after the fact, right? Like if I'm thinking through the score and like why he scored a certain way, like I'm thinking, all right, well, he was still able to accomplish all this stuff with this guy. Or like I think back to the Ohio State guys, right? Like Wilson, Olave, and then like, you know, that's why I was like, you know, like a ton of other people, holy shit, what JSN did while, you know, Wilson and Olave were there, like that was wild, right? And so there is an element where how does that look like in the model? And it's probably just one of those things that like, you know, we have to start testing and just kind of see what comes out and see if it's beneficial or if it kind of pulls us away from, you know, kind of what we were just talking about.
I honestly, I think that's a great point because I took it in just like, you know, one direction, and it obviously goes both ways. Like it can be a positive or a negative, and it's figuring out like, can you actually balance that
exactly
by the numbers, right? Like, can you weight that properly by the numbers and not get away from what you're doing? So honestly, you bring up a great point there. It may be too much added context, maybe, or context that's not able to be added by such like a binary, you know, in such a binary way.
But it's an interesting discussion. Yeah, exactly. 100%.
Yeah, it is. No, it totally is. That's funny. Okay. What about the most unexpected low score per the Unscore?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably Ricky Pearsall. And
okay.
Just because, like, you know, obviously with where he got drafted, and just kind of like the landing spot and everything like that, you know, it makes you think twice. Like, did we like? Can I swear on this?
Yeah, sure. Of course. Yeah.
Okay. Did we fuck up? Like, what the fuck did we miss? Like, you know, and like, what are we not seeing that everybody else is seeing? And again, that's where we go back to like, look, like, there's no kind of way around it. Like his analytical profile, like it sucks, right? Like, and that's why, like, it does. And that's why, yeah, it's another one. And that's why he kind of comes in where he comes in, right? Like he really didn't have a year that popped. Like he's a super old guy, like, but you know, these film guys, and that's what's made me kind of rethink him a little bit as far as like some of these rankings go and stuff like that. But yeah, like I wasn't expecting him to score high, but I wasn't also expecting him to score, you know, second to last out of 35 wide receivers.
What range did he fall in those ranges we were talking about before?
Oh, dude, he was, so let me just pull it up here. I mean, dude, he was 54.
Oh, so shit. So he's like in like the 6 point per game range, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeesh, that's not great.
No, he's in that like 4 or 5 point per range, right? Like that's
he's gonna have to be an outlier. Are there other outliers that like have hit that range that you guys see at all? Are there any outliers that you see hit that range that like you notice? If that makes sense, so, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I mean, obviously going back and this is why we think that, you know, potentially some of these guys would have been caught if we had some of that data. Because we really started to get this thing dialed in, like started in like the 2019 class, but like really started to get it dialed in for like the 2020 class, like just of what it was kind of spitting out for those top fives. And a lot of that was due to the contested catch stuff, right? And PFF doesn't have that going back to a lot of the guys that came out in like 2018, 2019. So like, that's why there are some misses in there. You know, specifically with like McLaurin, who also like dog shit analytical profile in college because like he was hurt, like his situation kind of sucked. And you know, DK, like he was there with AJ Brown, and really like those guys are outliers and you just have to be like kind of okay with it, right? Like those are going to happen. And you know, the other guy that actually kind of popped and then has now disappeared, but the model didn't like Chase Claypool. And then, you know, he kind of had that cup of coffee as like a relevant dude for a minute. And now he's obviously kind of back to, you know, exile. But just to kind of give you an idea, like, so last year, this is what, you know, this is kind of a way to look at and think about some of these guys, right? So we talked about the top 10. You had guys like Jermaine Burton, Jalen McMillan, Luke McCaffrey. So those guys in similar ranges from last year were Jaden Reed. He was an interesting one. Let me just pull up the 23 class for you here because
this is good stuff. We're here for it for sure.
Hold on, that's 22. Yeah, I just think it's good context as far as like, hey, like where did some of these guys kind of Josh Downs, another one that was kind of in that same range as the guys we just talked about. Zay Flowers was another one, right? So like those guys are like all like anywhere from 63 to 68. And then in the middle of those guys at 65 is like a Marvin Mims, right? So you're kind of seeing that hit rate start to play out. And, you know, maybe Marvin still has, you know, a path to being relevant there. But that's where, like, you know, 60 may sound like a bad score, But when you look at kind of like the way our model is built and everything like that, like 60 is still like you have dudes in there. So like thinking about it and paying attention to it, and like if you would look at that this year, like that's why for me, like a guy like Jermaine Burton, with where he's been falling in rookie drafts, like he's been a big target for me.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Are there any rookies who got disappointing draft capital that the score, the model still likes? You're on mute.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Say that again.
Sorry. I mean, I guess we kind of talked about this a little bit, but are there any rookies who got disappointing draft capital that the score still likes, that the UN score still likes?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is obviously Franklin, right? Like falling to day three, and still coming in as like that third ranked guy. He's definitely one. I mean, even honestly, I was surprised that McCaffrey stuck in the top 10 with going at pick 100.
I was going to say, and I created the sheet before knowing that draft capital is not heavily weighted. So that actually makes sense. And that's interesting because we weight draft capital so heavily. So I guess, your model is trying to get away from that a little bit and try to, I guess, define these players outside of what the NFL is doing, right? Because they don't always get it right. That's part of the problem.
And they don't. And like, this isn't to say too that like, because they don't get it right, like this means that we think that like we figured it out. But like, I just do think that like, I do think that NFL teams still make mistakes. And like, just because like a guy like, what we value when we talk about this, like, and we've talked about it already today, is like, we want this to be like the core of like kind of what we believe in value for wide receivers. And then like, if Ricky Pearsall has a dog shit profile and a dog shit score and then goes in the first round and then just like jumps up to, whatever, it's like, well, why are we building a model then? Right? Because like, if we're just going to make it all on draft capital, and look, I'm not saying like draft capital is obviously incredibly valuable and like there's absolutely, warranting like looking at it, but like we just didn't want it to tell the whole story for us, because like if you do, like you're like guys like Puka wouldn't have fallen in like the top 5 last year, right? And like guys like QJ probably would have been pushed up super high, and QJ came in at like a wide receiver 12 for us last year, right? So like that's where we just kind of noticed that like the NFL is changing, and because it is changing, like guys like Tank Dells can go later in the rounds and smaller guys and make impacts, right? So because of that, we wanted to be, not as straightforward as some of maybe the models in the past have been, and just try something new.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do like that idea of trying to create like a tool that is supplemental to the draft capital, because the draft capital, like, it does miss. Obviously, we preach all the time how important draft capital is, but I think it's more of from like a future opportunity and like a longer, like a leash perspective.
Absolutely.
Than it is like, oh, like you have to, the draft capital is the Bible. You got to live and die by it. And it's definitely not that. We've seen over the years how many guys, the McLaurin, you've mentioned half of them already, the McLaurins, all those guys. Draft capital doesn't always tell the story, that's for sure. So I like trying to build those kind of tools around it. So, we've talked a lot about the UN score, its value in general. Like, how much do you value it in terms of your evaluations, like your rankings? How much does it account for in that regard?
So again, I think at the end of the day, being an analytics guy, like, if I'm on the fence about somebody, I probably will lean to use it as like a tiebreaker of sorts. But like, there are guys that I will bucket for, man. Like, and maybe this is the fandom in me or whatever, but like, Javon Baker came in as the wide receiver 15 in this year's class, right? Like, he came in with a score like basically right at 60, which would say that, he's got like a 20% chance of like, getting to 14 points a game, like in years 1 to 3. It's not very high, but at the same time, like, that's just the guy that I kind of believe in and want to take a shot on, right? So like, I'm taking him over guys that the model has higher, right? So that's where, and that some of that is because like I watched his film and like he is super fun. I like the way he wins. Like, he can be a true outside X if it works. And it's not like he's just fun on film, but like, if you look at the last couple of years of his analytical profile, it's really strong. Like, I mean, 3.21 yards per route run. Dude makes plays. He can make plays after the catch. Good size wide receiver. So like, there are guys that I will bucket for, and like that's just like one example of me kind of doing that.
That makes sense. Okay. Do you think there are already ways you guys want to adjust and improve the score? Like, I know you guys kind of an ongoing discussion. You already guys have stuff set on the table ready to like kind of alter this thing a little bit, or is it kind of where you guys want it to be at this point for the wide
I mean,
receiver?
I think tweaks at this point, right? I think the foundation of it's probably there, but I think one of the things that is probably the main part of this conversation is kind of what we talked about earlier is, can we incorporate film in this with the model still kind of being true to what we originally built it for? I do think there's value in that. The other thing that, I kind of want to think about is, how we look at draft capital is because, I'm seeing some of the stuff where it's like, well, Troy Franklin was day 3 wide receiver. It's like, all right, well, he was picked 2 picks after Luke McCaffrey, who, went in the 3rd round. And if he just went 2 picks earlier, then we're not having this conversation about Troy Franklin being a day 2 wide receiver, and it's a 2-pick difference. So that's one thing where we wanted to try and potentially look at, like, maybe not making it as binary, like just because like a guy's, round 3, like there's really not that much of a difference between pick 100 and 102. So that and film are probably some of the main discussions that we're going to have.
Yeah. And it's super interesting where like Luke McCaffrey gets the top 100 pick. He's a 3rd rounder, and then Troy Franklin doesn't. And obviously the discussions are widely different. One was a much, higher end prospect, but it's just, it is interesting how like the difference in, what was it? Probably like 20 picks or so really changes the narrative, right? Like he was in the, Troy Franklin was in like the 115 area, right? Or like 104.
No, he was 102, dude.
He was 102. Oh, okay. He was 102. So yeah, I mean, it's
2 picks.
Not different at all. Yeah.
And if you look back at some of the last few years of the NFL, like if there's more supplemental picks, like the 100th pick has been in the 3rd round like a few times, and that's where I kind of struggle with, like, all right, the other thing is like typically when you look at day 3 wide receivers, I guess I'm like kind of on my Troy Franklin soapbox right now, but
that's fine. Let's hear it.
Typically when you look at day 3 wide receivers, like they don't have a profile like Troy Franklin's, right? Like he broke out at such an early age, like, obviously he was in the Pac-12. So like there is some of that, like you have to factor in, but like from an analytical perspective, his profile is like awesome, man. And like those types of guys, you really just don't, because like I went back and I just kind of looked at, some of the 4th round guys in like one of the best examples, and I hate doing this because like people have just like, this is what's happened over the last couple of days, is like everybody's like, oh, you're only going to draft Troy Franklin because of what happened with Amon-Ra, right? And it's like, well, like there's some validity to that, at least just from what we have, right? Like Amon-Ra's score was 76, Troy Franklin's was 79. They both went in the 4th round. They were like, Troy Franklin was like a 4.5-star prospect. Amon-Ra was 5. Like Amon-Ra had serious competition at USC, and Troy Franklin, he was kind of the guy, but like he also performed like very well while he was there. Like, so it's just, I don't know. It's an interesting kind of case study, just because I think he's being written off by a lot of people just because he's day 3, but I just think there's more to the story than that.
I do think it's an interesting conversation, and I'm going to jump to it because this was kind of, I wanted to talk about this a little bit with Franklin. Like, do you feel like you're holding on to your priors here at all? Or do you feel like the NFL and the people are just getting it wrong?
So and this is where I'm trying to be much better, right? Because I think probably 6 months ago, I would have been like, nah, dude, the NFL's fucking wrong. Like there's this profile is awesome. Like, I'm just going to stick to it. I'm definitely more open to the fact now that, like, look, he fell for a reason. So there's definitely teams that are worried about, whether it's probably his play strength, right? It's somebody with kind of his frame,
size.
and size. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Right. But, I just kind of, again, that's where I gravitate towards, like, all right, if he's got an awesome profile, and we've seen some of these guys recently have success, like, Devonta Smith coming into the league, he was like one of those first ones. And I'm not saying he's Devonta Smith, but I'm just saying from a size perspective, like these are guys that like were dismissed almost by some guys coming in because of, how big they were. And like Jordan Addison, also like kind of a slight wide receiver. Again, not saying he's him, but if the knock on him is going to be size and not like anything else, we've just seen Tank Dell, another guy, right? Like, so that's where I'm just more open to if we hadn't had recent success, like from some of these smaller, lighter frame guys, then I would probably be coming off that quite a bit. But I think the NFL's changed. I think it's, it's a lot quicker. It's like,
you're seeing a lot of the younger kind of coaching move into those head coaching roles, and not as much retread with some of the old heads, right? Like the Sean McVay tree and the Shanahan tree, like those guys are branching out through the league. And I think they're more open to taking guys and building their scheme around those guys. Whereas like for a while in the NFL, people would like draft specifically to fit their scheme. And like, that's one thing that like we tried to keep in mind with this is like, as the NFL has changed for where these coaches are more open-minded, we should kind of be more open-minded from like a grading them as a prospect perspective.
That's
love
fair.
It. Yes,
yeah.
Love it.
And to your point, Franklin's going to be probably cheap enough to where you can buy in still if you believe where it's not going to hurt.
It's funny you say that, man. I was like, so obviously, like I was bummed. Like I wanted the Patriots to take him, and then Denver trades up like 2 picks in front of us, and obviously that was super frustrating. But as he fell to the 4th, I was like, this is great. Like, I love Troy Franklin. Like, I'm just gonna have so much Troy Franklin. And
all of them.
I will say, like, I am surprised at like how much the community is still like bumping him up as high as he is. I think I've done 6 drafts now, man, and I have 1 share. And he consistently goes at like the 207. I think I was looking earlier.
He's 21st ranked overall, wide receiver 11, right behind Blake Corum. I'm looking at Dynasty Data Lab for the ADP right now.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking at earlier. So like I'm just surprised that like he's still going like that high, right? And the interesting thing here is, are we going to look back a year from now and be like, what the fuck were we doing taking a day 3 wide receiver over? I mean, shit, dude. Like first round wide receivers, like. Is that something that we're just going to be like, wow, we were just fucking stupid? Or is that something where we're going to be like, all right, those round 1 wide receivers or, early 2s, like had shitty profiles and, these guys that stuck to their guns are right? Like that. What do you think?
I mean,
I know that I could understand why he's still propped up. His trophy, I do pretty much all my scouting from spreadsheets. Billy watches all the film. I don't have time for all that. But so Troy Franklin was a guy that obviously popped off analytically, and I think people are getting more into that. And I think it's easier for people to digest and sit down and figure out all the nuance of film when you can look at a spreadsheet and you can conditional format it to show you colors, and you can look for all the greens and all the other stuff. It's a lot easier to intake, especially when you look at the numbers over and over and you really have an understanding of what they mean. Folks that are getting into it more like that before the draft were pretty high on Troy Franklin. And I think it's just getting easier for people to be like, I still really like Troy Franklin. I don't care that he went to day 4. Like you said, it was 2 picks away from not being in round 4. So I just think like there was such a following for Troy to begin with that he's just going to get popped up by us nerds that
do you think it's take lock then? Like, is that
that's the thing. It's hard to say it's take lock because his profile is so good. Yeah. Like that didn't change. The only thing that changed is where the NFL drafted him, and a lot of that,
which is new information, though, right? And that's something that like that I try to get better at, right? Is like your opinion should change as we get new information, and like how much are we supposed to weight that now, right? Like where do you guys? Let me ask you this: where do you guys have Troy Franklin?
Oh yeah, there. I'll go right to the DU rankings real quick. Just to.
But you're right. It's a really good point, man.
And I think one more thing to touch on that you've talked about with your model trying to move away from draft capital is that we don't know for sure, but we have a really good idea that the NFL puts a lot of stock into the underwear Olympics, 40 times short shuttle, all this other kind of crap. Yeah. So if you had any of that kind of stuff in your model, it's really double counting draft capital.
Exactly.
So 100%. I'm on board with leaving out any of that kind of crap for wide receivers. So
okay, so I'm writing something down so I don't forget because I want to say it. But our ranking on Troy Franklin, wide receiver 15, 27th overall, behind McMillan, Burton, Wright, Adonai Mitchell, Wilson, Corley, Leggett. Like that's kind of how the progression goes. We have them like tier 5 kind of grouped in with like the McMillan Burton group, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we're definitely not we weren't believers before. That's part of the problem, at least, you know, outside of analytics. Like the film wasn't great for us, but I'm wondering a few things, or I want to just comment on a few things. I do think in terms of people being willing to just like ignore the DC, like FF astronauts and like, you know, Galileo and that crew, like the stuff they're doing is giving the average dynasty player confidence to ignore what the NFL is doing, right? Because they're showing you, first of all, we're good at what we're doing and we're beating the NFL at this, at least from a fantasy perspective. We're beating the NFL at this. And that's going to give us more confidence to be like, screw you guys. If we believe in Troy Franklin, I'm going to still take him. I am wondering though, because I do think this is a big factor. If he wasn't drafted to the Broncos with Nix, would we still be as interested? Because I do feel like that's a big factor. Like people are looking at it like, okay, this guy is with he's with his quarterback. It's a familiar situation. They're already going to have chemistry. It kind of boosts a negative, factor in his profile, which is the DC. But then you're like, wait, it's to a place where they handpicked him and he's going back to his quarterback. Do you think that matters a lot? And do you think it would be different if he didn't go there?
So I'll tell you, for me right now, like absolutely. Like I've told myself that, like, oh, that's a softer landing spot than I was kind of expecting once I knew he was going day 3. So yeah, I absolutely think that that's factoring into it. And I think the other thing is too, it's like when you think about, you know, him not just landing with Knicks, but also the situation in Denver, right? Like, you know, Sutton seems to be potentially not long for Denver. So not only does he land with Bo Nix, but there's really, from a pass catching perspective, there's really just not that much there, right? So if you're kind of accounting for the fact that he's got that chemistry with him, he's got the great profile, maybe we're trusting Sean Payton a little bit too much here, like, you know. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, Willie. I mean, it's something that I think I started to notice myself justifying a little bit, and that's where I just have to almost just catch myself and be like, all right, like don't overweight that and start pushing him up higher. But like I had him pre-draft as like wide receiver 4, like pretty firmly, like that's where he was for me. And like now I think he's closer to like probably 9 for me, 9 or 10. So like, and I was like super steadfast on like Troy Franklin's like awesome, like he's probably not going to move or like whatever. And that's where like I think fluidity is important. And I was just, it's really interesting to see. I would have thought there would have been more of a drop potentially into the 3rd round, at least almost from an ADP perspective. But the fact that we're not out of the second is kind of wild.
Well, with that, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I'm going to let Billy go ahead and finish this episode off with you. I got to go be a father. So I really do.
Shame on you, dude.
I know. Yeah. I'd rather take ship around here. I appreciate you coming on, though, and love to have you back.
Yeah, Uriah, thanks, man. It was great to talk to you, man.
No problem. You guys have a good night.
Yeah, you too.
Awesome. Be easy, Uriah. All right, cool. So we already got into like rookie season, the evaluation stuff, but I do have some questions kind of leading into it a little bit that I did want to talk about. And so you just kind of got into it a little bit, and I think I know where you're going to go with it. But are pre-draft evaluations useful? You just talked a little bit about yours with the wide receiver 4 ranking of Troy Franklin and him moving, and I think that's actually that's really like showing some accountability and showing some like truth to your process. Like you're not just going to hold on completely to the priors. But I heard on a pod like 80% of the information comes post NFL draft, and I'm wondering if you kind of agree with that statement and just kind of your approach to pre and post draft rankings, like how those are important and how those factor in.
80 feels high.
It does. That's why I was
80 feels like we should find a new hobby from January to April. Like that's what 80 feels like. You know what I mean? Like if it's 80%, then like what the fuck are we all doing for, 3 months? So look, I think that there's more value on the surface than some people may think. Like maybe some of the more casuals think post draft. Yeah, like I think post draft, like, the biggest thing for me, man, is like when we get that new piece of information, and it's not just one, right? It's not just draft capital, but like then it's like landing spot, right? So then you start going into, how's this guy going to be utilized? Like, what's the coaching staff like? Then you looking at a guy like, I think Xavier Legette's like a really kind of good example for this. Is we've seen what Canales has done these last few years, right? Like super impressive, dude. Like what he's done with Geno, what he did with those 2 wide receivers in Seattle, and then coming last year to Tampa Bay, getting the most out of Mike Evans. Like, yeah, Chris Godwin wasn't great, but like what he did with Baker, revitalizing his career. So like obviously there's optimism for somebody like Bryce Young, and then they go, and the ironic thing is we were live for Undroppables doing like a draft stream, and we saw that the Panthers traded up, and I was like, they're gonna fucking take Leggett right now, and it's like gonna be Jonathan Mingo, like whatever. And ironically, like that was the case. But you hear Canales talk about like how they're gonna use him and everything like that, and that's where I just think that's where this gets tougher for some of the people that maybe either don't know as much or are just not as plugged in, right? Because Keon Coleman is another really good example. Obviously everybody knows Matt Harmon, and he's awesome and everything like that. But one of the things that he's been talking about with Keon Coleman is like, if they stick him out on an island on the X, that's going to be a disaster, right? But then you look at, I think in Underdog recently, like for best ball, like dude, I think he's got pushed up in like the 60s, right? So like. And there's a scenario here where like he goes for 600 yards or 500 yards or whatever, right. And if X doesn't work, like then how does it work schematically, right? Because like Dalton Kincaid is like basically like a big slot, so you can't really have like two big slots if Coleman doesn't work outside. And so that's where I think like navigating the course after the draft, like a lot of it is like you kind of got to be in the weeds a little bit as far as like how these guys are going to be utilized. And that's where I go back to like, I think we need to remember like these teams aren't picking for fucking fantasy football, dude. Like these teams are picking for real life football. And I think some of these places, like some of these wide receivers, like Adonai Mitchell, for example, right? Like I'm not a huge Adonai guy. I get like the allure of him. Absolutely. I do. He's an absolute freak of nature. But I think when I look at somebody like him, like I think he does more for the Colts offense just from like a real NFL perspective, but he might not be like a fantasy impact guy, right? Like, and that's where I think delineating, like it can still be a good pick for them if he doesn't become this super startable wide receiver, because if he changes what they're able to do, like opens up the top and allows Downs and Pittman to work more underneath, or like
you nailed it. I was going to say it.
So like, where are you at on something like that? Like, do you think it's 80% or how much are you weighting some post-draft stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's 80%. I think it's probably more like 60% or so. Like it's definitely very, very important, and more important than the static information we have pre-draft, obviously. Like knowing their situation and being able to add some context, like you said, to like the scheme, what they're going to do, how they can be utilized is really important. But it's useless if you aren't. I think what you said is so important. If you aren't plugged in, it's super underrated. Like knowing what these teams want to do, knowing what the coaches' tendencies are, is one of the most important things. And I don't think you can even really apply the information post-draft if you're not really dug in. So I think that's a big part of it. But I think a lot of people, when they're saying that, is like watching these players for 4 months, 5 months, or whatever.
Yeah.
Depending on when you start your process, is kind of you're not, the returns aren't great on that work, and it's diminishing returns. That's the coined phrase, right? But I just think that there's so much value, and I think the 80% line kind of devalues familiarizing yourself with these players, because even if you get the landing spot and you get the draft capital, if you don't know how they perform, and by that I mean like what the things they do on the field and how they do them, how are you going to know how to apply that to the landing spot and say, okay, well, they can utilize them in this way? Like,
exactly.
I just think that because it's a time-consuming process, and it's something that requires skill, just like any of this. Like breaking down data requires skill. Like you have to have some idea of what you're looking at. You have to know where to go, what to do with it, all those things. I think that it gets kind of tossed to the side, like we shouldn't be doing this, or it's not as important. But to me, I just think familiarizing yourself with the class is one of the most important things you can do leading up to the draft. So I think the pre-draft work is extremely important. And then you have a baseline of where to work off of your own values. Cause it's really about understanding how you value the player at the end of the day. Right. So that's kind of how I view it.
No, I totally agree, man. I think, if I think back to a couple of years ago, and if I saw somebody like, a Keon Coleman, it's like, holy shit, Steph Diggs just left, Gabe Davis just left. Like, I'm going to like, dude, screw this. Like, he's going to be Josh Allen's one outside guy. Like, whatever, like I wouldn't have any concerns because I wasn't as plugged in as I was back then, right? Whereas like, you know, I probably would have like pushed him up my process, right? Because it's like he's going to be Josh Allen's wide receiver 1 or whatever. And that's just like one, like, I'm not saying like that's how everything plays out, but like that's where understanding like how these, to your point, like understanding how these guys fit in the league and with these teams is really important as far as like expectations, right? Because like, you know, I think you look at a guy like Ladd McConkey, right? Like for what he's going to be walking into there. Like the other thing is like target competition, right? Like I love Ladd McConkey this year because just there's a lack of pass catchers in with the Chargers, right? So like I think there's a world where he could outscore Rome Odunze this year because Rome's competing with, you know, Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. And that's something where if, you know, you said that pre-draft, you'd be kind of, you know, looked at with, you know, 3 different heads or whatever. But that's where like looking at the new information and realizing what the situations these guys are walking into is like a huge part of understanding like their value and their either how they accrue value or potentially lose value in subsequent years.
The Keon Coleman use case is going to be so interesting to go through this year because it gets to this conversation for sure with him where I feel like the average dynasty player who doesn't do their own analysis is going to lean on like he's their X receiver, he's their guy. You know what I mean? And that's easy to do. And not saying that won't be the case. Like it certainly can be the case. That's what they plan. That's what they want to do. And he is a talented guy. But not knowing all the information is going to lead you to make more risky bets more often. And with him, he's just one of those where I don't think the cost is worth it necessarily in the rookie draft, or at least where you may have to take him to secure him in the second round. I'm cool with it. But I've seen him be pushed up into the really like the 109 to 112 range. I've seen that happen too many times for my comfort level. So I think that's where like kind of knowing who he is and his situation leads more informed members of the community to be like, maybe not. Whereas I think you can make more mistakes by not really knowing these things. And that's kind of what we're getting at.
Absolutely. I think one of the ways that I think about this, just to kind of, you know, tie that off, man, is just we're playing in probabilities, right? Like we're trying to make bets on these guys and really avoid bad bets. And of course, like you're trying to find, like you're never going to be 100% one way or the other. Like you're trying to find these little margins over time, and those wins over time, they add up to like a good team. Like, let's put it that way. And to your point, like if he gets pushed up into like that 110 range, like I'll let somebody else take that risk. And if he hits, then great for them. Right. But that's just something that, you know, I see more risk there at that spot. So I'd probably just lean in a different direction. And that's just kind of how I think about these guys, right? Like it's all opportunity cost.
Absolutely. And like I go back to the term like value hawk when I think of like how I play this, and like I'm not trying to be the guy that's going to reach. I want to take the value that's falling. And more times than not, like some people are like, no, you're not risk averse for this reason, that reason. But I think holistically, I'm very risk averse overall. And that'll have me missing out on like a Rashee Rice if he comes back and like, boom, you know what I mean? Because I'm not going to go for those kind of guys, or Keon Coleman even. But more times than not, it's really put me in a position where I'm not holding the bag on something that I don't want to be. And where I'm holding the bag on something that's at least maintaining value. So that's what I'm trying to balance, you know, keep that balance, but, you know, take my shots, but kind of calculated aggression in a way, if that makes sense.
That's
calculated
a good term.
Riskiness. Yeah. I coined that while playing like a video game one time, by the way. So I'm glad I could bring it over to the dynasty world. All right, let's talk a little bit more player specific here. You were a Bucky fan pre-draft, right? A Bucky Irving fan?
I was, pretty big.
No,
yeah.
I'm not saying it in any way because I wrote you weren't, and then I switched it because I figured I was wrong there. Okay, so what did you like about Bucky pre-draft? Because you were even above consensus after the combine performance. So are you still in with this Tampa Bay landing spot?
I don't love it as much as like some people have kind of made it out to be. Just because like one of his calling cards, like the reason why I like Bucky is because his ability to contribute in the receiving game at like a significant level, right? And with the way I look at running backs, man, like we talked about the elite RBs earlier, but if I'm not going to have one of those elite RBs, the way I want to take shots on running backs that kind of fill up my team, like I really want them to have like pass catching profiles. So they're either finding themselves on the field and getting on in more ways than one, or if they're only getting on for a certain amount of time, like I don't want it to be the early down work. Like if I'm in a PPR league, like give me those fucking 3 or 4 catches or whatever he's going to get, right? Like, so that's kind of how I look at guys like outside the elite ones. And that's obviously like why I liked Bucky. The problem is, Rachaad White, for better or for worse, like, he does some of the same things from a receiving perspective that like you would want, like you would hope that he went to somebody that was, a non-receiving back. There is some optimism that I do have as far as the potential role that he can have, just because like Rachaad White from like an efficiency perspective is really one of the more inefficient runners like in the NFL the last couple of years. So one thing I've kind of thought about is like, look, like, can he steal early down work here and there if Rachaad continues to be inefficient? And if that's the case, then does he carve out drives for himself? So they know that like, if one comes on or one comes off, like they're not telegraphing kind of like what they're trying to run or what they're trying to do. Bucky comes on and they do it a few times in a row or a few weeks in a row. And it's like, all right, well, Bucky's coming on. Rachaad, they've moved away from him running, so they're going to run the ball, right? Like, so if he can start carving out like drives for himself as opposed to like just plays, like that's where I think it kind of starts. But I'm definitely not out on him. And I think, Uriah said it earlier, I'm not like a huge combine guy, dude. Like I'm really not. When guys run fast,
F that RAS score.
I mean, look, don't get me wrong. Like when it comes to tight ends, like
we care.
I will eat that shit up. But like when I, seeing Brian Thomas Jr. run like 4, like that did not change my opinion of Brian Thomas Jr. It just like didn't, dude. I knew he was like a freaky guy on the outside. Like when you watch him play, like you realize like he's built different, right? Like you kind of realize that. But the times where I do care about a little bit is like when it's like absolutely dreadful, and like unfortunately like Bucky's was like pretty dreadful, which is why I ended up dropping him, because I think I had him at like RB3 pre-draft, man, like pre-combine.
Yeah.
And again, this kind of goes back to like I don't love the running back class, so if a guy can contribute in a couple different ways and he is one of the better receiving backs, then look, like I think I still had him at 6 or something like that pre-draft. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, no,
I still like him.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I can see why folks would like him. It's interesting talking through the way you talk through it. Usually you hear like he's going to take the passing down work, or you like him because he has that ability. But it isn't. It's like seeing them in the roles that you kind of described would be such a juxtaposition with like how you see their body types. I feel like
I know.
Rachaad White's the big dude. He can't run through he can't run, through between the tackles well. But Bucky, small dude, might be able to run through the tackles kind of well. And both of them are good pass catchers. But I just don't see them removing Rachaad White from that role personally, because he's done such a good job at that specifically. So
I mean, how crazy is it, dude, that like a guy like Bucky Irving had a higher yards after contact per rush attempt than like a guy like Braylon Allen, right? Like that to me just speaks to none at all. And like obviously like something, it's obviously not super predictive or anything like that, but I like when guys can make guys miss, and he can make guys miss, both in the rushing game as well as the receiving game. And when you heard some of them talk about how like the offensive coordinator, I think his name's Liam Cohen, one of the things he said was Bucky gets up to top speed fast, right? Mm-hmm. And he's very slippery. So like maybe if he can be more efficient, then yeah. But you're right. It's a super juxtaposition as far as like these roles. Like, oh, everybody would say that he'll take some of the passing stuff, but like I wonder if that's flipped a little bit.
No, and that's a good point, because I haven't really considered that, and he could still carve out a role in that way. So I get kind of keeping his rank up there and still believing. That makes sense. Okay, so I want to talk about another running back here, Kamani Vidal. He goes to the Chargers, guy out of Troy, small school. What gives you confidence and gave you confidence pre-draft in this guy?
So when I watched him, he just felt like an NFL guy that's going to be in the league for a few years, right? Like it's not like he's super flashy player, but just feels like a solid, dependable running back. And like those guys have value in the NFL. It doesn't mean he's going to be like a stalwart on your fantasy team for a while, but like with the lack of like kind of difference makers in this class, opportunity is still like king from a running back perspective, right? And he seems like a guy that when you watch him on tape, specifically, not only just like following his rush lanes, having nice contact balance and, being that guy that can grind you out like 3, 4, 5 yards, like when you need it, like best pass blocker in the draft. And that's one thing where, when I think about if you're a later running back going, you need to be good at like, you need to either be really good at one thing or you need to be well-rounded. And for him to, the way I look at it is like, how do you find yourself in the field if you're a later round pick? And it's like, all right, well, if I'm the best pass blocking back on the team, then maybe he starts carving out third down work. And then you start looking at, okay, well, was he a receiver in college? Yeah, he actually was. Like he had the 4th most receptions in his college career out of any of the RBs that were drafted, right? So like now you're putting the pieces together where he can catch the ball out of the backfield. We saw him do it in college. He's a very good pass blocker. So if he gets an opportunity, can he be like a super cheap dart throw that maybe lucks into some 3-down work in the event of an injury, right? Like those are the types of things that I'm looking at for guys that are kind of going in his range. I mean, what's he at right now on Dynasty data for ADP?
I'm popping it up right now. That's a great question because I've seen him kind of sneaking up into the
what's the highest you've seen him go?
I think like mid beginning of the third, like 302, 3. I think I actually took him at like maybe like end of the third, 308, 39 in a league where I knew the league and I knew he wasn't coming back to me. And I had like plenty of wide receiver. I just didn't, and there wasn't like a great bet to make there. So I felt like it was okay, but it was definitely a little bit of a reach. So his ADP right now is running back 9, 39th overall. So, I mean, he's really not creeping up there per ADP. So you can definitely get him super cheap. But just my experience is I've seen that he's not making it out of the third very often these days.
Oh, same. I mean, I took him at 309 in a draft. That's the only place that I've got him. The last 3 or 4 drafts I've done, man, he's gone pretty much in that like 3.4 to 3.6 range.
Yeah, which is, I do think that we are jumping the shark a little bit on that. Like, I mean, why did I get rid of it? Just talking through some of the guys that are there. I mean, it's probably worth like a little chat in terms of who you'd kind of take him ahead of. But if we were to throw him up to the 301 range, then we're talking about taking him over, the Javon Bakers, maybe a Burton, a McMillan, maybe a Bucky, a Ray Davis. Like those are all guys that I feel pretty. I mean, not Bucky as much. Like I think I would take him over Bucky personally. But Ray Davis, like I think that's a really good situation for him. I mean, maybe it's my Patriots bias getting to me, but I was a big Javon Baker pre-draft. Yeah. So, I mean, you can make a case for it, though. I get it. Like, I do get it.
Are we gonna be right on Javon Baker, man? Like, is he gonna be super fun?
I think so. I think he's just he's got great hands. I think that he's really, really good in contested catch situations, but he's also, I think he creates good separation. So I thought, I don't really know because there wasn't any red flag off the field issues or anything like that. He was super productive at UCF. Obviously, maybe the NFL is looking at him transferring all over the place as a negative, but like I just didn't really think that there was a ton of negatives to his game. So for me, I mean, we could actually get into this right now because you and I are Pats fans. How do you feel about the Polk pick, and how do you feel about Baker versus Polk? Are you in on Polk now with the high second round draft capital?
So I will say, I mean, he came in what? Let me just pull this up here. He came in 11th from a Unscore perspective in this year's class. So like respectable. I gotta say, like draft night, I was kind of scorned, like, or that second draft night, I was like, Franklin's there. Like, let's take Franklin. And like, clearly, like, I was wrong. So initially I was like, what the fuck? Like, this is like the Patriots, like just getting in their head again, as far as wide receivers. Like, is this just going to be a repeat of everything that we've seen? This is where some of my take clock, like I'm trying to get better. And I do think it's gone away. I'm definitely more open to the idea of Jalen Polk. I think one of the reasons why, man, is because the way that they've kind of gone about addressing like how they're going to build around May, right? Like, all right, we're going to go like Demario's the slot guy. This Polk makes really good, like tough catches, goes over the middle. Let's put him at Z. And then now we're going to go get a guy in Javon Baker where he can go outside and play X. And like, now it feels like we have a plan. and it just feels like we haven't had a plan in like a really long time. So I'm more open to the idea. Obviously, like it helps when like guys like Matt Harmon and other people like him too, right? Like that, it's like a little confirmation bias, like after your team picks him. But I mean, I don't know. Like I think I don't know if he's ever going to be like a startable fantasy wide receiver, like maybe like a flex play or something like that if you need it. But I think he's going to be, I think he could be a better real life NFL receiver than fantasy. What are your feelings on Polk?
When Harmon is throwing out the lunch pail kind of guy, you know, the hard worker, like when he's going outside of his realm of like here's the route data and everything, I get a little concerned, like, all right, we're trying to, you know, make him a culture guy almost or something like that. But I couldn't get there on film personally.
Yeah.
But I'm open to the idea that he's a good fit for the team and that he can be a good NFL player. I don't really see the upside for fantasy at all, especially in like the mid early second, where I've seen people taking him who are just relying on the DC and hoping for the best. I can't get there. I think at the end of the day that Baker is going to be the guy they want to be the guy, if that makes sense. Like they're going to get these guys on the field. He obviously, you see all the videos, he has the dog in him. He's going to be the guy who is demanding or earning most of the targets, I think, at the end of the day. So I think it could be fun. I think it's interesting, like how you're bringing it up, how they have a plan, right? And I think it's great that they have a plan. I do agree, as a Patriots fan, agree with you. It's been flying by the seat of our pants for too long. But like the plan seems to be, you know, Drake May, like almost like they think Drake May needs guys who can, like, almost like they don't believe in his skill set, which is a weird thing to say. Like they're like, okay, this guy's not super accurate. We need to get guys who can catch outside the frame, who can be good in contested situations, who can help him out. And like, I guess it's a good thing, but it kind of feels like eating away at some of the confidence that they have in like the third overall pick in the draft. Because like the Polk pick was a reach, no matter how you slice it.
Well, what makes it really brutal too is like not at 37, like once we traded back, that's where I was talking about Franklin, but like to trade out of McConkey and then see that, like that's what like infuriated me. But
no, I agree, because I would have much rather, to this day, I say this, I would have rather sat there, take McConkey, and find another way to get Baker. Like you can do that. You can find, there's probably 10 different ways you could have figured out a way to get up in the fourth if you wanted to. And I know that I think they got an extra fourth from moving back. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
They did. Yeah. They swapped their fifth for that fourth, which was Baker, but
right. But again, you didn't need to, there's other ways to do that. I don't know. It's just, I think they could have gotten a player that I would have even though I didn't like Trey Franklin, I think I would have been happier with a Franklin type pick, being like, okay, like this is his Tez Walker, who I'm not a big fan of, but this is his guy who he can just like sling this thing to, and they're going for the upside. The new age of the NFL really launched, and this feels almost like they're going to try to put him in like a Brady Mac Jones box of like play a little more reined in, where I want to let this guy. I want to let him let it fly, and hopefully they do that anyway. It kind of feels like with the skill players that they're putting around him, the structure, that's the way they're kind of going about it, which is fine.
So I think it's a good point, and it's something that I've actually kind of thought about recently. So one of the things is like, look, I like our draft. I like what we did. By no means do I think like this is the iteration of like, you know, the group of skill guys that Drake is going to go forward with and be super successful with. I think this is like the start of a real wide receiver room, which is just like something that we haven't had. Adding somebody like, you know, I don't think it's going to happen, but like adding like an Ayuk or like Higgins next year in free agency, like that, like stuff like that would be super fun. One of the things that I have thought about though is, you know, with the way the league has changed and like all the too high shells that you see and everything like that, right? Like the days of like, all right, we're not going to let like Tyreek Hill like beat us deep. It's like a lot of it's like death by 1,000 cuts underneath now. And I just wonder if like guys like Polk maybe have more value with like, hey, it's like not like because of those too high shells, you're not going to like, we're going to make you go through long drives. Like you saw the Kansas City Chiefs last year. It was like literally like 6-7 yards. Everything was around the line of scrimmage. So like, I wonder if that's like part of the change where like maybe these guys like Polk have more value as opposed to like, you know, a few years ago. It's just, I'm not saying it's working theory.
It's a great point. I actually like it just came up with it in my head, and I don't think it's like the perfect comp, but he like Jalen Polk, I think is basically Tyler Boyd. Like that's the kind of player which is not a bad thing, and from a real football perspective is a freaking great thing. So if he can be that for the team, which I think he can, then they're probably cooking with gas with that wide receiver core. And if they got a Higgins, an Ayuk, I mean, now
you've got something potentially.
Yeah, now we're really cooking. This is like we're on fire. So I think, that should be their goal, because I think that opportunity is going to be available between this time this year and this time next year, getting one of those guys on your team. I really think you do that, and this team is in a great place, especially with the wide receiver core, where it opens the field up for these other guys. Now if they do that, I would think that Javon Baker maybe didn't become exactly what they believed in.
100%.
So that's a little bit of a worry. I will, before we move on to this next thing, I just want to clarify the Kamani, I know I'm going back, but the Kamani Vidal, the love that you had for him pre-draft, that was basically all built off of, from what it sounded like, film. Like I'm sure you were grinding some data, but were you looking at film and you saw Vidal and you're like, this guy looks good? Ooh, might have lost you there.
Oh, I got you back.
Oh no, you're back.
Can you hear me?
You're good.
Yeah,
you're good. Sorry, did you catch what I said? If not, I can.
I think it was, did I like him off of film as opposed to data? Is that?
Yeah, like it sounded like you found Vidal more from like watching him on film and being impressed. Yeah. Is that not the case?
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. Because like
you might need to join our side, brother. You come over to the film grinder side, because that's pretty impressive. That's why I wanted to bring it back up. That's pretty impressive that you saw him and he ended up being a guy who the rest of the community is in on too. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, if you looked at a spreadsheet, like he's not a guy that really jumps off the page for you. And like, yeah, he does some things, but I think some of the raw stuff, like from a total perspective, that's where I started to get intrigued, right? Like when you have 90 catches in college, like you have my attention at least a little bit. And then you start like looking at some of the other things, right? Like that's where I went back and looked at some film. And then, you look into those other things, like some of the pass blocking stuff, because, I want to see how these guys can carve out that role at the next level. And when he starts stacking up these little wins, like that's how he becomes like a late round flyer for somebody like me, right?
Love it.
Or a lot of the guys that undroppables, because like now the drafts I'm in with these fucking guys, I can't get them anywhere.
Dude, I know how that is with our listener leagues. It is insane, bro. Like everybody is sniping me left and right. I can't get anything done in these damn leagues. So, but it's a good thing. It's competition. It's fun. I love that. But for those, for DeWiz fans out there, not just in the sheets, this guy's grinding film too, man. Very well versed. I dig it. Okay, so we talked about Franklin. We don't need to go back there. I'm interested in what was it just the sheets you didn't like what you saw on film from Adonai Mitchell?
So a lot of it was the sheets, right? Like when you look at his profile, like it's just something that's not going to hit. I get, and I fully appreciate the fact that like Ewers like missed a lot, right? Like there's a lot of like film where Adonai is open, but there's also like those plays where he takes off, right? And it's just like, if he's not getting the ball, and maybe that's some of that. He knows that quarterback plays shitty and it's not going to end up happening or whatever. But like that's just like, if you're going to have that type of profile and be that athletic, like maybe I just wanted him to do more, I guess.
That's fair.
Even just a little bit. But look, I get the allure of him. It's just, again, I think like somebody at the next level, like I would have volume concerns with him. I don't think he's going to be like a Michael Pittman that's going to go out and get 140 targets and, kind of win that way from a PPR perspective. Like he's going to be like a big play guy. And like one of the things I said, I think a few months ago, was like, what if he's just like a bigger, newer Gabe Davis, where like he gives you these explosive, like I'm not saying they're the same. I'm just saying like that archetype of player that's like very boom bust and like can be super fun and like has a.
Why do you have to do that? Now I'm envisioning that actually being the case, and now I really see it. I'm like, damn, is he really just Gabe Davis again? He's gonna be running wind sprints, opening up the field for Josh Downs, and oh boy, I mean that makes sense. I think to fade with the landing spot, he's an easy fade at this point, so that makes a lot.
I will say, like some of the stuff that he does, like on film at his size, like look, I'm not gonna lie, like it's very impressive, and that's it gives you ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I was very impressed with him on film. Like, no doubt about it. He was up there in my film grades. Took a hit, obviously, post-draft. I actually know people like Ben Winkler who was at or is with DFF still. He's still in on Adonai. He thinks this is a great landing spot for him. So there's, definitely a range of outcomes here, and there's definitely different ways to view it. I'm personally not super in on it. I was more in on him pre-draft, to be honest with you. But this next one is the one I think I'm most interested in to hear, because I don't think I've heard I've brought anybody on here who's been able to give me like a good case for this guy. And I'm not trying to dog anybody. I just would like to hear a good case for Jaheim Bell. I'm an FSU alum, been watching this guy. Okay.
Shit, I didn't know that.
And watching this guy, all I saw was like literally half the time, I swear to God, I thought he was a running back. For FSU, I thought he was like, because he played like H-back, fullback out of the backfield, and they would run him. Like they legitimately would run him. And so I like from time to time, I'm like, who's this Bell guy? He's an interesting running back. And then finally I realized he's like a tight end. I'm like, okay. So like for me, he's not a blocker at all. He's a tweener. There's just so many things, red flags for his NFL profile. What about him is giving you confidence heading into the league?
It kind of goes back to a little bit of what we've talked about up until this point with some of the other positions, but I think it's the forward-thinking nature of some of these coaches now in the NFL being more open to tweener guys, right? Or guys that don't fit the typical, NFL, like, dude, you don't have to be, Mark Andrews anymore at 6'5", 250 or whatever, right? Like you look back at some of the guys like Laporta, McBride, like, dude, he's just about an inch shorter than Laporta, and he weighs the same amount. Like, you're going to tell me that like size is a super big issue for this guy? Now, look, I'm not saying from a blocking perspective they're the same, but like the size argument to me, I don't find as much weight in it as I used to. And like when you just think about some of the things that he can do, I remember watching him when he was at South Carolina, dude, and I was like, dude, this dude is like at his size, like he is wild, like he is super, super fun. And then he goes to Florida State, and I don't know, like for me, one of the things that I value for tight ends specifically, and we'll talk about it with the guy next a little bit, but like missed tackles forced per reception for tight ends for me is like, that's like a thing. Like I really do put some value on that. And when you look back at some of the recent guys, like, obviously this year, like a freak of nature in Bowers, but, somebody that popped that was super late last year, but had a great missed tackles force was Tucker Kraft. Like he had a very good missed tackles force per reception. And Njoku, another one, just fantastic from a missed tackles force. So when you see that, it's kind of like, it's obviously like a sign of athleticism at the tight end position, but it's not just like, hey, I'm athletic. It's like that shit's translating to the field as well. Right. And so like, and obviously, Barrett threw out some super awesome stuff that just gives you ideas, right? Like his he had the third best yards per route run by a tight end since 2020, only behind Bowers and Pitts. Right. So like, obviously he's not saying he's Bowers and Pitts, but like, dude, if he lands in the right situation, he's basically free right now in drafts. Like that's a guy that like I'd like taking a flyer on.
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. And I know it's the Patriots bias. Don't you kid me. I know.
I mean, dude, for sure.
You're excited, right? I mean, he has some work to do behind Hunter Henry, who I think is still a really solid tight end in the league. So he's gonna, I mean, he has a different role probably than him, because they're never gonna put him, like in line, like really blocking, because he's a big guy, but he's like almost got like chicken legs in a way. He's like light in the pants. He doesn't have a great base, so he doesn't get low, doesn't get the pad level low, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's going to be interesting how he finds his way onto the field. Like that's going to be I think the biggest hurdle for him. I'm interested in terms, I never looked into this, and obviously yards per route run, if you have fewer routes run, that can be impacted. I didn't look into this, but I am interested in how many routes run he ran compared to historically the tight ends. I don't know if you have it in front of you.
If you give me keep talking.
I'll don't worry. I'll make sure we get there. I just like I don't know if the volume. I muted myself. I don't know if the volume is low, but I assume just based on the role he played that it might be lower than the typical tight end on average. So yeah, like. I will say, so from a career perspective in college, now you got to account for the fact that he played 41 games, right? So when you look at routes per game, like it's definitely lower. His total routes in college was 545, right? Which was higher than the likes of Hawkinson, Njoku, Kmet, Kraft, Musgrave. Like it's higher than those guys. He also played 41 games. Right. Like, so like it is going to be higher than those guys.
So when you look at like a routes per game perspective, like that's where he's definitely lacked. But I will say from like a total perspective, it's probably, I mean, he's 40 less than Fant.
Is
He's
that
50 less.
that's his career yards per out run, right? Okay, yeah, I'd
His
love to
career,
see like
his career yards per route run for college is 2.3, right?
yeah,
And like
that's great.
when you look at that for tight ends, dude, like these are just some of the bigger names that have come out. Like Goddard obviously like went to South Dakota, like so you kind of have to take that out. But Bowers 264, Andrews 263, Likely 242, Pitts 236, Kincaid 232, and then you got Bell 23, right? And then McBride's right below him, Dolchich and Njoku, Evan Ingram. Like so, like he's just with names that are like super interesting and like he's free.
Yeah, no, you know what? Like that makes a lot of sense. Like laying it out that way, it does make a lot of sense being in on a guy like that. And then, like you said, if you're getting him after the Theo Johnsons and the Eric Alls, like he's actually probably a good bet at that point. So I guess maybe I'm holding on to my priors here and not kind of leaning into a free asset that might have some value down the road. So I mean,
you're probably right. You're like the odds are low that he hits, but
they are. But I think there's, in terms of how I'm talking about him and how I view him and how I'm like relaying it to the audience, I do think that there's maybe more of a middle ground than maybe I'm giving credit for at the outset of this conversation. However, I'm going to go back to what I was seeing in that Scott Barrett tweet too, where it's like, I'm pretty sure he was pushing kind of the tight end 2 in the class narrative. Yeah. And I just don't think that is somewhere we should be, if I'm being honest. He's free. Take the free money and see if you can get something from it there. But I don't think we should overstate kind of the profile personally. But you and I can totally rejoice on Ben Sennett, a guy who you and I were early on, right? Like this is a guy who I've been talking about since January, a guy who I think probably around the same time I was seeing tweets from you come out, maybe, shortly after, maybe before me. I can't pinpoint when it was, but I know I saw you come out and I was like, oh shit, my guy's in on him too. This is good stuff. So what was it? What I will say is something you alluded to, the missed tackle force thing. One of the first things I do when I'm going to watch film too, before the tight ends, I'm like, let me go to PFF real quick. Let me look at the missed tackles force. Let me see how elusive these dudes are, because that's going to highlight the guys who have the ability, who possess the ability. They may not be able to capitalize on that ability. They may not get there, may not develop, but they have that, right? And then I go and I look at the film and I find Sennett and I'm like, holy crap, this guy is a well-rounded player. So what was it for you early on that kind of tipped you off on a Ben Sennett?
Yeah. So it was definitely not film first, right? So I think it was after you, right? I started kind of looking at tight ends a little bit more in like February, kind of right around there. And as I was going through, just like looking at some stuff, like obviously knew Bowers was great, but like, is there anybody outside of Bowers that, could be fun? And when I saw like his career missed tackles force was, 0.259, right? Like he's got to obviously, not in the SEC, wasn't asked to carry the load that Bowers was, but like he's got a higher missed tackles force per reception career than Bowers, right? So like now you have my attention, and like he's up there. Like here's the list of guys like relevant in the league where he's kind of around from a missed tackles force. It's Njoku, it's Kraft, it's Bowers, it's Laporta. Ferguson's had success. Likely's up there. Kittle, obviously you have misses in there like Chig and Irv Smith, but like. He just like kind of looked like a guy that I could be interested in. And then, you turn on the film and like, he's a super fun player. And then you just see like the size too. Like, he's not one of these slight tight ends that's, on the lighter side at like 230, 235. Like he's solid, like 250 pound. Like he's a big dude. And the amount of wiggle that he has when you see him move at his size is like, that's what's intriguing.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. And it's funny for me, our co-host Jake, he pointed out to me that like I have this knack year to year of like trying to go find like the underrated tight end that nobody knows about. And I definitely do have a fetish for it. Like it is like, I'm trying to think. Last year, nobody liked Mayer. Whenever Mayer came out, nobody was a big fan of Mayer, or not a big fan, but like a lot of people were like, everybody's better than Mayer. And I was like, no, this guy is like the best tight end in the class. Let's stop doing this. Or one of the best talents in the class. But I'm always trying to find those guys. And I think digging into the data, it's elusiveness that you're always looking for, in my opinion, when you're trying to find like who the target should be. But yeah, Sennett is just like, he's one of those guys who literally looks the part when he's playing. Like he's got that low center of gravity body style.
Yeah.
Right. That can keep his pad level low and he can block. And he's a fierce player before, after the catch, at the block point, like everything.
Yeah.
So I love when the data meets the film kind of, and it all lines up. And then for some reason, I don't know what it is about this player. I really don't. But Ben Sennett's still a guy who you can get at the end of the second round. He's a second round draft pick to the Washington Commanders. Got to get that right. And I just don't understand it, man. Like I've seen him fall to the third in plenty of leagues, and I'm like doing my best to trade up and get him. I'm like, what the hell is going on here? But something about him, people still don't seem to know. Like this guy is the second best tight end in this class, hands down. Like without a doubt.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, one of my buddies. No, it's funny. Sorry. It's funny you say that. One of my buddies like knows a lot of football. Like definitely not like sickos like kind of we are and like in the space like as much as we are. And he was like, hey, so like who do you like for tight ends? And I was like, well, obviously like outside of Bowers, like my favorite dude has been Sennett. Like that's who it is. And he's like, why is Jatavian Sanders not 2? And I was like, dude, I'm telling you right now, Sennett will go before Sanders in the draft. And he was like, you're out of your mind. I was like, all right, dude, $50. He goes before him. And when he got that day 2 draft capital, like I was pumped. But obviously, like there's like confirmation bias in there because you're like, oh, I was right. But like to see him get that draft capital, I just hope that Cliff doesn't tease us and like play fucking Zach Ertz like way too much in the beginning and makes us wait for him. But
I'm actually going to throw it back to you because I think it's a great conversation to have. Like, what was it about JT Sanders that pushed him below Sennett, or vice versa, whatever? What was it about Sanders that was like, he's not going to be tight end 2?
The athleticism scared me a little bit.
Because
again, like when it comes to tight ends, like that's where I definitely value it. And just seeing, I think Sennett had like when it came out, I'd have to look back at it, but he was like 98th percentile from a RAS perspective when you look at like the 1,300 tight ends that have been run through RAS. And so when you see that at like his size, like and everything else that he does, that to me right there is like, all right, like I'm in. And Sanders I thought was going to test like so much better than he did. And yeah, I look, he made fun plays at Texas. Like I still enjoyed watching him. I still think that like his landing spot in Carolina is actually really not that bad for him, right? Like there's not, outside of Deontay Johnson, like there's question marks almost everywhere from a pass catching perspective. And, first pick of the 4th round is not terrible. So I still am intrigued by him. And, I just took him at 3.4 in a super, like, so in a 0.75 tight end premium, right? So like, I'm still open to the idea of him. Sennett was already gone. I don't have one share. I don't have one share of him, dude.
Oh my goodness. I have so many shares. I got to lend you one. I can't believe it, bro. That's insane. I would have thought you would have been all over it, but it's tough. Dude, it's tough in these drafts when you're drafting with people who know you, like you mentioned, and it's difficult. So I totally get that. My last note here on Sennett and what people are thinking of him. This is from a day ago on Twitter. Why are we talking about Sennett? Seems to have a weak profile. So I don't know what people are looking at in terms, like I laid it out for this person. I was like nothing about his profile is weak. So I don't get it, but that is the general feeling around him, it seems, and I don't know why. So you can still take advantage of Sennett in your more average general leagues if it's not people who have been like looking at your work here and there. He's still somebody who I think you can target. But with that, listen, Dan has given us so much of his time today. Been really generous. I told him we'd be an hour. We went freaking well over that. I didn't even realize. I'm so sorry, but we'll leave it with one question here. Who could be this year's underrated rookie darling? We've had the Pukas, the Dells. Like, does a Brendan Rice or a Luke McCaffrey, who you actually talked about, who's ranked pretty high in the Unscore, at least, surprisingly so, do they have that kind of potential, or are we just shit out of luck and there's none of those guys this year? I
think what we saw from him was lightning in a bottle. He landed in the perfect situation. And, he took to it, like what he did with Cooper as soon as he got there, just like attaching himself to him, with Cooper just like also kind of battling some injuries, giving him an opportunity, landing with somebody like McVay, who like reminded everybody that like he still had his fastball last year. Like there was a lot of things that had to happen for Puka to happen, right? And I just don't think that that's something that you're probably going to see too much. But like as far as one of like a later guys, there's probably nobody in like the fifth that I think about, but some of the guys in the third, McCaffrey would definitely be one, right? Like obviously the score, is something that would have identified there. I think the thing that I like about him is, he's only been playing wide receiver for a couple of years, moved from quarterback. So like, I think he picks up an NFL offense pretty quickly, and he's a smart player. And like, he comes from, and he probably walks into, maybe not right away, but like he's probably wide receiver 3 there in like pretty short order. And if Dotson sees struggles or whatever, like, does he become a reliable slot option for, somebody like Jaden Daniels, right? Like that's kind of the path. But I think the guy that, I kind of gravitate to a little bit more is, he's not going as late as Puka was last year, but I mean, I've seen him still go in like the early third, and I just think that's way too late. But Jermaine Burton, I just think has like, from a value accrual perspective and the opportunity is like, there was a lot of people that had like first round grade on him from like, if we're just talking about like the on-field stuff and not some of the stuff that, kind of creeped into the rest of his evaluation. But I mean, dude has like strong hands, like can make plays after the catch, is not afraid to go over the middle. And like, if we're being honest here, T. Higgins is not back in any way, shape, or form in 2025 with the Bengals, right? It's just not going to happen. So Absolutely. He's going to be wide receiver 2 in a Joe Burrow offense. Like I will sign up for that guy in the third round, because if he hits and realizes some of that potential, I just think that his path to, I think it, I use keep trade cut to just kind of see what the masses are thinking, right? Like where's like the overall community on somebody. And I think he's wide receiver like 62 on there right now. And I just think if he's a wide receiver 2 in a Joe Burrow offense and has, 600 yards his rookie year, like he's jumping up so much higher than that.
That's an absolutely great shout. And he's going around that JT Sanders range. Corley, Baker. I mean, he has as much, if not way more upside than those guys. I totally agree with you there. And the on the field stuff, super impressive. Absolutely some of the best hands in the class. Dude can track the ball, and he's, listen, if he can keep himself clean, like he's going to be pretty solid, I think, in the league. So that's a great shot. And I think he's going late enough to kind of qualify for that. So yeah, I love that. And listen, with that, we're going to let you get out of here. All right. I know you got some stuff to do tonight. Yeah. I know we've kept you long enough, but listen, we really appreciate all your time here. I love chatting with you on Twitter and all that stuff. And I absolutely think we're going to have you back on here if you will allow that, because there's some more stuff I want to get into, kind of more of your background, and just, as we go on, there'll be plenty more to talk about, obviously, but this was just a great time. So everybody go follow Dan at Dan J. Whisner on Twitter. All of his work at the Undroppables. Those guys do great work, by the way. I love all of them. Like they do really good stuff, and I'm always, checking out everything they put out. So definitely check it out. Is there anything else you got going on that you want to mention to the audience before we get out of here?
No, I mean, yeah, like there's a bunch of great people doing some awesome stuff over there. Like Willie said, if you're interested in some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, in the UN, as far as the Unscore goes, make sure you go over to the undroppables.com, check it out. Everything's over there. Trav and I are actually going to be recording our podcast here in a few minutes. So I've got double duty here, but we're going to be doing like a Twitter contest giveaway. So, head over to my Twitter in the next couple of days, and, we'll be giving away a copy of that as well. But Willie, man, this was awesome. I had a blast. I texted Trav. I was like, dude, I'm going over. It's fine. Like I'm having fun. So this was a great time, man.
Good. Well, if we weren't having fun, you could have just told me, that's it, we're done. We're cutting it here. Right? So, no, this was a great time. Everybody, again, like I said, follow Dan at Dan J. Whisner on Twitter. You can follow us at Dynasty Underdog, at Willie Beeman FF, at Jake Abrams, and at Uriah Dawkins. I got those all right. I feel great about that. We're out of here now. Take it easy, guys. Peace out. Have a good night.